The morning Margot Hayes turned 19, the sky over Denver was the color of old iron. She stood on the concrete steps of the County Youth Housing Center with a faded canvas backpack slung over one shoulder and $43 folded flat inside her wallet. That was it. That was everything she owned in the world. A few worn shirts, a paperback novel with her mother's handwriting in the margins, a toothbrush, a wool sweater that was two sizes too big, and $43. Behind her, the heavy metal door clicked shut with a sound that was quiet but final. For 4 years, that building had been her whole world. The rules, the schedules, the shared rooms where every sound traveled through thin walls, the quiet understanding that none of the kids inside had anywhere else to go. Now she was legally an adult, which in practical terms meant something much simpler. She was on her own. The parking lot was mostly empty. Patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the edges of the asphalt, melting slowly into muddy water that pooled in the cracks. A cold wind cut straight through her thin jacket, and she pulled the sleeves down over her knuckles. Her hands were chapped. Her boots were thin in the soles. She could feel every pebble she stepped on. And yet, standing there in the gray morning light, Margot Hayes did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying did not change anything. Crying did not open doors. Crying did not put food on the table. Crying did not bring back the mother who had disappeared when she was 7 years old, or the grandfather she had only seen a handful of times in her life. So instead, she breathed, slow, deliberate, the way her grandfather had once taught her when she was a small girl, with tangled hair and a chipped front tooth, standing on the edge of his gravel driveway, trying not to cry. "Breathe, kid," he had told her. His voice was rough from decades of sawdust and cigarette smoke. "Breathe and then you think. That's the order, never the other way around." She had been 9 years old then. It was the last time she had ever seen him. Now, 10 years later, she stood in a parking lot with the wind biting at her fingers, and she breathed. A social worker had handed her a thin manila envelope just before she walked out. The woman's name was Diane, and Diane had the tired eyes of someone who had watched too many kids walk through that door with nowhere to go. She had pressed the envelope into Margot's hand without ceremony. "This came from the probate office," Diane had said. "It belonged to your grandfather. I'm sorry it took this long to reach you." That was all. No explanation, no follow-up, just an envelope and a tired woman who had already turned back to her paperwork before the door finished closing. Margot looked down at the envelope now. The paper was yellowed at the edges. Her name was typed neatly across the front. Margot L. Hayes. She ran her thumb over the letters. For a moment, she did not want to open it. For a moment, she wanted to leave it sealed, because whatever was inside would not bring her grandfather back, and whatever was inside would not make the next night any warmer. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, especially when you have nothing else. She slid her finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside were two pieces of paper. The first was a short legal letter on cream-colored stationery. The second was a hand-drawn map. The map was crude the way a builder draws things when he is not trying to be an artist. A thick line for a county road. A thinner line branching off labeled Old Timber Road. A crooked rectangle in the middle of what she assumed were pine trees. And in the corner in handwriting, she recognized, even after 10 years, a single word. "Yours." Margot's throat tightened. She turned to the letter. It was short. 2 paragraphs. It stated that the undersigned, her grandfather, Arthur M. Hayes, had left a parcel of land to her to be transferred on her 19th birthday, and that to claim said property, the sum of $10 would be required to cover unpaid back taxes. The letter was signed by a law office in a town she had never heard of called Silver Pine. $10. She read the line 3 times, just to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding it. $10 for a piece of land. It sounded ridiculous. A cup of coffee at the gas station down the road cost almost that much, which meant one of 2 things was true. Either the letter was some kind of clerical mistake, or the property was so worthless that nobody else had wanted it for a very long time. She folded the letter slowly and slid it back into the envelope. Her fingers were shaking, but not from the cold. Across the road, the mountains stretched out in long blue ridges, fading into the distance like frozen waves. Somewhere out there, according to the map, was the place her grandfather had left her. She hadn't thought about him in years, not because she didn't want to, but because life had a way of pushing old memories into quiet corners where they could not hurt you so easily. Still, she remembered things. The smell of sawdust on his flannel shirts, the way he always carried a pocket knife and a carpenter's pencil behind his ear, the slow, patient way he explained things as if every small task was worth doing right. She remembered him kneeling on the porch of a cabin she could no longer picture, clearly showing her how to drive a nail without bending it. "Hit it clean, kid," he had said. "Life's too short for crooked nails." Arthur Hayes had been a builder, a man who worked with his hands. He had never been the type to play jokes. He had never been the type to write a letter unless he meant every word of it. That thought stayed with her. $10. It wasn't much of a risk. Even with only $43 left in the world, 10 still felt small compared to the alternative. Because the alternative was simple. Spend the little money she had on a cheap motel for a few nights, eat one meal a day, and then find herself in a city shelter by the end of the week. She looked down the empty road. For the first time in years, there was no one telling her where to go next. No schedule, no curfew, no caseworker with a clipboard. Just a choice. And sometimes when you have nothing left, even a strange, uncertain choice feels like hope. She slid the envelope into the front pocket of her backpack, pulled the zipper closed, and started walking toward the bus station. The bus rattled along narrow highways that wound through pine forests and small, forgotten towns. 4 hours. That was how long it took to get from Denver to Silver Pine. Margot sat by the window the entire time, the envelope resting on her lap, her forehead pressed against the cold glass. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world seemed to become. The city disappeared, at first swallowed by suburbs. Then the suburbs thinned into highways lined with billboards nobody had updated in years. Then even the billboards were gone, replaced by long stretches of guardrail and the occasional gas station leaning slightly toward the road, its sign faded from decades of mountain sun. Margot watched the country change through the window. Flat turned to hills, hills turned to ridges, ridges turned to mountains dark and blue and endless. She watched the trees grow taller and closer together. She watched the sky turn from gray to a washed-out white, and then slowly as the elevation climbed to a high mountain blue that hurt to look at directly. She did not talk to anyone on the bus. Nobody talked to her either. An old man in a trucker cap dozed across the aisle. A woman with a baby in her arms hummed quietly near the front. The driver chewed gum and listened to a country station on the radio turned down so low it was more static than song. And strangely, that felt okay. For the first time since leaving the housing center, Margot did not feel like someone was watching her. No caseworker tracking her progress. No other kids sizing her up. No adult deciding what her future should look like. She was just another passenger on a bus heading somewhere unknown. That anonymity felt like a kind of freedom she had never tasted before. She thought about her grandfather. She let herself just for a little while. She remembered the last time she had seen him. She had been 9 and her mother had driven her up into the mountains for what was supposed to be a short visit. The driveway had been gravel and her grandfather had come out onto the porch in a flannel shirt and work boots, his hair already silver, his hands stained dark from stain and oil. He had crouched down to her level. He had looked her right in the eye. "You remember what I told you about nails?" he had asked. She had nodded. "Hit 'em clean." He had smiled, not a big smile, just a small one at the corner of his mouth. "That's my girl." That was all she remembered. A week later, her mother had dropped her off at a friend's apartment and never come back. A month after that, the friend had handed her over to the state. A year after that, her mother was dead. Overdose. Cheap motel. Nobody at the funeral except the caseworker. Margot had been 9 years old. She did not cry on the bus either. She just watched the mountains. Silver Pine turned out to be smaller than she expected. A single main street, a diner with a flickering neon sign that said Eats, a hardware store with a wooden front and a bell above the door, a feed supply, a post office the size of a garden shed, and at the far end of the street, a small brick building with a faded brass plaque by the door. Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law. Margot stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, backpack over her shoulder, the envelope clutched in her hand. Then she climbed the steps and knocked. "Come in," a voice called. The office inside smelled faintly of paper and pipe tobacco. Law books sagged on a tall wooden shelf. A brass desk lamp with a green shade cast a warm circle of light across a blotter. Behind the desk sat an older man with silver hair and round wire-frame glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up as she entered. "You must be Miss Hayes," he said gently. Margot nodded. She was suddenly very aware of how young she must have looked standing there. 19. A worn backpack, a cheap jacket, boots with holes starting to form at the toes. She cleared her throat. "I got the letter," she said. The lawyer studied her for a long moment. His eyes were kind, but there was something else in them, too, something careful, something like a man who had been waiting a long time for a door to open. "My name is Ellery Whitmore," he said. "Please, sit down." She sat. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. It was worn at the corners the way a folder gets when it has been picked up and put back down many, many times. "Your grandfather purchased the property nearly 30 years ago," he said. "It has no utilities, no road access to speak of, no registered structures on the county record. For all official purposes, it is raw land." He slid the paperwork across the desk. "If you choose to claim it, the transfer fee and back taxes come to exactly $10. Margot reached into her pocket and placed a slightly wrinkled $10 bill on the desk. Ellery Whitmore did not pick it up. He looked at the bill, then he looked at her, and something in his expression softened in a way that made her chest feel tight. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "before we proceed, there is something you should know." She waited. He took off his glasses, folded them carefully, set them on the blotter. "Your grandfather came into this office 12 years ago," he said, "sat right where you are sitting now. He was a quiet man, didn't waste words. He paid me a sum of money up front to handle this transfer when the time came." He paused. "He paid the entire legal fee in advance for 10 years. Margot stared at him. "10 years," she repeated. "He knew exactly when your 19th birthday would fall," Ellery said. "He knew exactly what courthouse would handle the paperwork. He knew exactly what to do if he passed away before the date." The lawyer shook his head slowly. "In 41 years of practicing law in this town, Miss Hayes, I have never seen a man plan a single day so carefully. He told me only one thing about you. He said—" Ellery paused as if he wanted to get it exactly right. "He said she'll come on her own. Don't go looking for her. She has to choose it." The room was very quiet. Margot felt something shift in her chest, something she did not have a name for, a man she barely remembered, a man she had seen for maybe 3 afternoons in her entire life, had sat in this office 12 years ago and planned out her 19th birthday down to the dollar. 12 years ago, she had been 7. Her mother had still been alive. She had still believed in the small, private way that children believe things, that someone was going to come and take her home. Her grandfather had believed it too. He had just known it would take longer than she could imagine. Ellery slid a single object across the desk toward her. It was an iron key, heavy, dark with age. The kind of key you do not see anymore, the kind a blacksmith hammers on an anvil. It sat on the wood with a small, solid weight that made everything else in the room feel lighter by comparison. "This was left for you as well," he said. Margot picked up the key. It was cold in her palm. She closed her fingers around it. She signed her name where he pointed. The pen trembled slightly in her hand. When she finished, Ellery Whitmore closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "The directions are in the envelope," he said. "Follow the county road 3 miles. Turn onto Old Timber Road. You'll have to walk the rest of the way. It's about 2 hours on foot." She nodded. At the door she paused. She did not know why. She turned back. Mr. Whitmore, she said, why $10? The old lawyer looked at her for a long moment. I asked him the same thing, he said. Once, years ago. His eyes were very gentle. He said, I don't want her to be given anything. I want her to buy it. Margot stood in the doorway with the iron key in her palm. Then she stepped out into the cold mountain afternoon. The directions the lawyer gave her were simple on paper. In reality, it took her almost 2 hours to find the place. The dirt road called Old Timber looked less like a road and more like two faint tire tracks cutting through tall grass and scattered lodgepole pine. The farther she walked, the quieter everything became. No traffic, no houses, no voices, just the wind moving through the branches above her and the soft crunch of pine needles under her boots. Her backpack felt heavier with every step. More than once, she wondered if this had been a mistake. $10 might not seem like much, but when it was almost a quarter of everything you owned, it mattered. Her feet were starting to blister. The cold had worked its way into her jacket. The sun was already dropping behind the ridgeline, and she had no idea what she was going to find. Eventually, the dirt road faded completely into the forest. According to the map, the property was still another half-mile ahead. Margot pushed through a cluster of thorn bushes, ducked under a low pine branch, and stepped into a small clearing. And there it was. For a long moment, she just stood there staring. The structure in front of her looked worse than anything she had imagined. It was a long, curved building made of corrugated metal, the kind of Quonset hut the military had used after the war and then abandoned in fields across the country. It sat crookedly in the middle of the clearing, like some giant rusted shell left behind by time. The metal walls were stained orange and brown where years of rain had eaten through the surface. Weeds grew all the way up to the sides. A few broken windows stared back at her like empty eyes. This was it. This was the property she had just bought with her last $10. Margot let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Well, she murmured to herself, guess this is home. Her voice sounded small in the clearing. She walked slowly around the outside of the building. The ground was soft and uneven beneath her boots. Small saplings had begun growing near the base of the walls, as if the forest itself was trying to pull the place back into the earth. At the front, two large metal doors were chained together with a thick rusted padlock. She stopped in front of them. She reached into her pocket. The old iron key felt surprisingly heavy in her hand, heavier than it had in the lawyer's office. For a moment she hesitated. A strange thought crossed her mind. What if the key didn't fit? What if the lock had rusted shut? What if this whole trip had been nothing more than chasing a ghost through the mountains? She pushed the thought away and slid the key into the lock. At first, nothing happened. The metal resisted. The key refused to turn. She frowned and tried again, twisting harder this time, her knuckles white around the iron handle. For a second, it felt like the key might snap. Then suddenly, clunk. The lock gave way with a loud metallic snap that echoed across the clearing. The chain slipped loose and fell against the doors with a hollow clang. Margot's heart began beating faster. She grabbed one of the handles and pulled. The door groaned as it opened, the hinges shrieking in protest after years of silence. Cold, stale air spilled out from the darkness inside. It smelled like rust and old dust and something faintly sweet, something she could not place. For a moment, she could not see anything. The interior was enormous and completely shadowed. A single beam of late afternoon sunlight slipped through a narrow crack in the roof, cutting through the dust-filled air like a spotlight on an empty stage. She stepped cautiously inside. Her footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. The place was much bigger than she had expected, an empty, curved cavern of metal walls and silence. There was no furniture, no tools, no sign that anyone had been here for years. Her shoulders sank slightly. Maybe the lawyer had been right. Maybe the land really was worth less. Maybe her grandfather had spent 10 years planning a gift that turned out to be nothing but a rusted shell and a patch of weeds. She took a few more steps into the building, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. That was when she noticed it. Something sitting directly in the middle of the floor. Right inside that single beam of sunlight, a wooden crate, small, old, completely out of place in the empty building. Margot frowned and walked toward it slowly. Her footsteps echoed softly across the concrete. The crate looked ancient. The wood was darkened by age and dust. Thick rope handles hung from the sides. The lid had long since disappeared. She crouched beside it and brushed away a thin layer of dirt. Inside were rows of glass jars, the kind people use for canning vegetables. At first she thought they were empty. Then she lifted one. It was heavier than she expected, much heavier. Margot held it up toward the light. Inside the jar were tightly rolled bundles of paper stacked one on top of another. Her brow furrowed. Carefully she unscrewed the lid. The smell of old paper drifted out. She slid one bundle free and unrolled it slowly. Green paper spilled into her hands. $20 bills. Dozens of them. Margot froze. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. She grabbed another jar and another. Every single one was filled with tightly packed bundles of cash. Her hands began to shake. She sat down heavily on the cold concrete floor, staring at the crate as the reality slowly settled over her. There were at least a dozen jars, maybe more, each one filled with money, more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. She counted one bundle slowly just to be sure she wasn't hallucinating from hunger and cold. $20 bills, 50 of them, $1,000 in a single stack. And there were 4 or 5 stacks in every jar. And there were at least a dozen jars, $45,000, maybe more. Sitting in a rusted shed in the middle of nowhere in a crate on a concrete floor in a building nobody had entered in years. Her breath came short. For several long minutes, Margot Hayes just sat there on the cold concrete, the jar resting in her hands. Real money. The kind of money she had only ever seen behind glass counters at a bank or in movies. The worn green bills felt almost unreal between her fingers, soft with age. The edges slightly faded. She looked around the empty building. The quiet had changed. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt like something had been waiting. Then something inside her broke loose. A short laugh escaped her, not the kind that comes from joy, the kind that comes when a person has been holding too much inside for too long. The laugh turned into a shaky breath. Then suddenly her eyes filled with tears. They came fast and without warning. Tears for the night she had spent wondering where she would sleep. For the 4 years inside crowded group homes where everything belonged to someone else. For every moment she had felt like the world had quietly decided she didn't matter. For the mother who had died in a cheap motel. For the grandfather she had never gotten to thank. The strange thing was, the money was not what overwhelmed her the most. It was the realization that someone had believed in her enough to leave it there. Someone had planned ahead, protected her future before she even knew she would need it. Someone had sat in a lawyer's office 12 years ago and said, she'll come on her own. He had known she would make it. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and took a slow breath. Okay, she whispered to the empty building. Okay. The word echoed faintly off the curved metal walls. She stood carefully. One by one she checked the other jars. Every single one was the same. Bundles of cash wrapped in old rubber bands packed tightly inside the glass. At the bottom of the crate, beneath a layer of dry straw, something else caught her eye. A thick leather notebook. The cover was worn and darkened with age. Embossed in faded gold letters across the front was a name. Arthur M. Hayes, her grandfather. Margot sat back down on the concrete floor. Her hands were steadier now. She opened the journal carefully. The first page was not filled with notes or numbers. It was a letter. Her eyes moved slowly across the neat, patient handwriting of a man who had spent his whole life measuring things twice. Margot, if you were reading this, it means 2 things. First, it means you made it to 19. Second, it means you were stubborn enough to open the crate instead of selling the land to the first man who offered. That makes me proud. You probably think the money is the important part of what I left you. It isn't. The money is just a tool. What matters is the land. People will tell you this place isn't worth much. Let them believe that. You and I know better. If you're reading this, it means you now have something no one else can take away from you. A place to stand, a place to build. Hit 'em clean, kid. Grandpa. Margot lowered the journal slowly. Her eyes drifted around the massive empty building again. The rusted walls, the cracked concrete floor, the dust floating lazily in the beam of sunlight from the roof. A place to stand. Until that moment, she had been thinking about survival, where to sleep, how to stretch $43 into as many days as possible. Now, for the first time in her life, she was thinking about something else entirely. A future. He had not left her money so she could run away. He had left it so she could build something. Something real. Something that would still be standing long after both of them were gone. Outside, the sun was dropping fast behind the mountains. The forest around the clearing had begun to grow quiet in the way that forests do when night is coming. Margot closed the journal gently. She placed it back into the crate. She covered the jars with the old straw lining. She pulled one of the canvas tarps from the corner and draped it over the top, almost instinctively, already understanding that this was something to guard. Then she stood and walked toward the open doorway. The cold mountain air brushed against her face. For the first time since leaving the housing center that morning, she did not feel lost. She did not feel like someone drifting through the world without direction. She had something now. Land, a shelter, a chance, and as she looked back at the rusted building behind her, a small, determined smile appeared on her face, because suddenly the place did not look abandoned anymore. It looked like a home waiting to be built. She stepped back inside to build a small fire from some dry scraps of wood she had found near the wall. She had a book of matches in her backpack. She had enough tarps to make a bed. She had water in a bottle. She had everything she needed to survive one night. The first night she spent on the property was colder than she expected. When the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, the temperature dropped fast. The metal walls of the old building held no warmth at all. Every gust of wind outside seemed to travel straight through the curved steel shell. She had no sleeping bag, no heater, only the thin jacket she was wearing and the wool sweater that was 2 sizes too big. She gathered a pile of old canvas tarps she had found in the corner and laid them across the concrete floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enough to keep the cold from creeping up through the ground. Then she sat there in the dim, fading light, listening. The forest had its own language at night. Branches creaked, wind whispered through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then again. For a moment, fear pressed against her chest. She was 19 years old, alone in the mountains, sleeping inside a rusted building she had owned for less than 8 hours, with $45,000 in cash hidden under a tarp 10 feet away. A year ago, the thought would have terrified her. But something about the place felt different now. Not safe exactly, but honest. No locked doors, no schedules, no strangers deciding what her life should look like. Just silence and possibility. She lay down on the tarps and pulled her jacket tight around her shoulders. She put her backpack under her head for a pillow. She watched the last beam of sunlight fade through the crack in the roof. She closed her eyes. Somewhere she drifted. And then in the deep middle of the night, she heard it. A sound she was not expecting. Footsteps. Slow, careful, coming around the outside of the building. Margot's eyes snapped open in the darkness. She did not move. She did not breathe. She lay absolutely still on the cold concrete floor, every muscle in her body suddenly awake, every sense sharpened to a knife edge. The footsteps stopped, right outside the metal wall, just a few feet from where her head was resting. She could hear the person breathing, slow, controlled. The breathing of someone who did not want to be heard. The breathing of a man. Margot's heart pounded in her ears so loudly she was certain the stranger outside could hear it too. She thought of the crate in the corner, the tarp covering $45,000 in cash, the iron key still in her jacket pocket, the door she had not locked from the inside because there was nothing to lock it with. The footsteps started again. They moved slowly along the side of the building, circling it, She could hear the soft crunch of pine needles under heavy boots. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where they were going. They were not lost. They were not wandering. They had come here on purpose, in the middle of the night, to a property that until this morning had officially belonged to no one. The footsteps stopped again at the front of the building. There was a long silence. Then, so soft she almost thought she had imagined it, she heard the low sound of a man's voice. Just a few words, spoken quietly to himself or maybe into a phone. She could not make out what he said. But she understood the tone. It was the tone of a man who had found something he had been looking for. Margot lay on the concrete floor, staring up into the darkness of the curved metal ceiling, her hand closing slowly around the iron key in her pocket. And outside on the other side of the rusted wall, the footsteps began to walk away. Margot did not sleep the rest of that night. She lay on the concrete floor long after the footsteps faded into the trees, her fingers still wrapped around the iron key in her jacket pocket, her eyes open in the darkness. Every small sound outside made her pulse jump. The creak of a branch, the shifting of the wind, the soft, distant call of an owl that had gone silent right about the time the stranger had started walking. She waited until the first gray light began to creep through the crack in the roof before she moved. When she finally sat up, her whole body was stiff from the cold. Her breath came out in pale clouds. She rubbed her arms and walked slowly to the front of the building, pushing the heavy door open just wide enough to slip through. The clearing outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost holy in the early morning before the birds have started and the world has remembered itself. A thin frost covered the tall grass. The pine trees stood perfectly still. And there in the soft dirt near the base of the metal wall, she saw them. Boot prints, fresh, large. The tread deep, the kind of boots a workman wears. Not hiking boots, not hunting boots. Work boots. A size she guessed that would fit a man well over 6 feet tall. She crouched down and touched the edge of one of the prints. The dirt was still soft at the bottom. He had been here only a few hours ago. Margot straightened up slowly and looked around the clearing. The prints led from the tree line, walked a full circle around the building, stopped once at the front door for what looked like a long pause, and then led back out again, disappearing into the pines on the far side. She stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold air. Someone knew she was here. Someone had come in the middle of the night to look. And whoever he was, he had left without knocking, which meant he had not come to welcome her. She went back inside, packed her backpack carefully, and covered the wooden crate under 2 layers of tarp, pushing an old bench on top of it for good measure. Then she walked out into the morning and started the long hike back towards Silver Pine. She had questions now. She had questions for anyone who might answer them. The bell above the door of the hardware store chimed softly as she stepped inside. The place smelled like wood shavings and machine oil, and the faint trace of pipe tobacco that seemed to live in the floorboards. The shelves were stacked high with tools, rope nails, bolts, and equipment she could not begin to name. A large pot-bellied stove sat in the back corner, radiating a slow, steady warmth that made her realize suddenly just how cold she had been for the last 24 hours. Behind the long wooden counter stood an older man with weathered hands and gray hair cut short under a faded ball cap. He looked up from a newspaper as the bell chimed. He did not smile, but something in his face changed when he saw her. Something Margot could not quite read. It was not surprise. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. The kind of recognition a man has when a door he has been watching for a long time finally opens. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough but quiet. "Morning," Margot said. He studied her worn backpack, her thin jacket, the dust on her boots from the long walk into town. He did not ask who she was. "You're Margot Hayes," he said. She stopped. For a second, she did not know how to answer. Nobody in this town should have known her name. She had told no one. She had come off the bus yesterday afternoon and spoken only to the lawyer and the driver. "How do you know that?" she asked. The old man set his newspaper down. He folded it carefully into thirds the way a man folds something he respects. I've known it for 3 years, he said, ever since your grandfather passed. The stove crackled in the back corner. My name is Hollis Reed, the old man said. Your grandfather was my best friend for 41 years. He asked me to keep an eye out for you when you came. Margot stared at him. She did not know what she had expected walking into this store. Maybe tools, maybe a skeptical clerk, maybe a blank face in a polite transaction. She had not expected a man who had been waiting for her since she was 16 years old. He told you I would come, she asked. Hollis nodded slowly. He told me you come on your own, he said. He told me not to go looking for you. He told me that when you finally walked through that door, I was to treat you like a customer, not like a project. He paused. His hands rested on the wood of the counter. I figure I can do both. Margot swallowed. She had not cried in the lawyer's office yesterday. She had not cried in the clearing. She had not cried when she found the money. But there was something about this old man standing behind his counter in his faded ball cap, saying he had been quietly waiting for her for 3 years without telling a single soul, that made her eyes sting in a way she did not have the strength to fight. She blinked hard. I need tools, she said. Hollis Reed nodded. I figured you might. He stepped out from behind the counter. He did not ask what she was building. He did not ask about the money. He did not ask about the footsteps she had heard in the night, because she had not told him about those yet. He simply walked slowly down the main aisle of the hardware store, pointing at things as he went. Axe, he said. You'll want a 3.5-pound head. Anything heavier and your shoulders will quit on you by the second day. Anything lighter and you'll be out there forever. Handles are hickory. Don't let anybody sell you fiberglass. It cracks when it's cold. He reached up and pulled one down. Handsaw. This one sharpens easy. Hammer, 20 ounces. Rubber grip. Pry bar. You'll need it for the old nails. He laid each tool carefully on the counter as they walked back. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves who has been doing the same thing in the same building for 50 years and has nothing left to prove. At the end, he added a box of long nails, a coil of rope, a canvas tool belt, and a pair of thick leather work gloves. Margot reached into her backpack and pulled out a $20 bill from the single bundle she had brought with her. Her fingers hesitated. She did not want Hollis Reed to know how much money was sitting under a tarp out in the woods. Not yet. Not until she understood him better. Hollis did not look at the money. Your grandfather had a credit here, he said. 30 years. Never carried a balance over a week. I kept it open after he passed. He slid the 20 back across the counter toward her. You're on that credit until I say otherwise. I have money, Margot said. I know you do. She stopped. Hollis looked at her calmly over the top of his reading glasses. Your grandfather didn't bury money in the ground, kid, he said quietly. Not literally, but near enough. Margot went very still. He told you, she asked. He told me he was saving for you, Hollis said. He didn't tell me where. He was a careful man. He didn't tell anybody where. But I knew him well enough to know that when Arthur Hayes said he was saving, he meant it. He slid the 20 back across the counter a second time. Keep it, he said. You're going to need every dollar for things I don't sell. Margot looked down at the bill. Then she looked at the old man in the faded ball cap. Mr. Reed, she said, last night somebody was outside my building, walking around it. I never saw him. I only heard his boots. Hollis Reed's hands went still on the counter. For the first time since she had walked in, the calm in his face cracked just slightly at the corners. How big were the prints? He asked quietly. Big. Work boots. Yes. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said very slowly, Miss Hayes, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your grandfather did not leave you that land by accident, and he did not keep it secret by accident either. There are people in this county who have been waiting 30 years for that property to come up for sale. Quiet people, patient people. Not all of them are strangers. Margot felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Who? She asked. Hollis Reed picked up the pile of tools on the counter and handed them to her one by one the way he would hand them to any other customer on any other morning. He did not answer her question directly. He did not have to. When he comes back, Hollis said, and he will come back, I want you to do two things. You keep your door shut, and you send somebody down to the store to find me. Day or night, you hear? Margot nodded slowly. She did not ask him how he knew the stranger would come back, because she could see in the tight line of the old man's jaw that he already knew who it was. She spent the next 3 days alone. She worked from the moment the sun came up over the ridge until she could no longer see the head of her hammer in the fading light. Her hands blistered the first day. The blisters broke on the second. By the third day, they had started to harden into something that was no longer her hands, but also not yet a builder's hands, something in between. She cleared the clearing first. She dragged fallen branches to the edge of the trees. She pulled weeds from the base of the walls. She swept the concrete floor inside the building with a broom she had bought from Hollis and pushed 2 years of dust and dead leaves out through the open door. She patched the crack in the roof with a heavy tarp and rope. She climbed up a ladder Hollis had quietly delivered to the edge of the dirt road one morning, tied off the corners, and came down with her arms shaking so badly she had to sit on the concrete for 10 minutes before she could stand again. She found an old cast iron wood stove buried beneath a pile of rusted equipment in the back corner of the building. It took her 2 full days of scrubbing and sanding to get it clean enough to use. When she finally lit the first fire inside it, she sat cross-legged on the floor and watched the flames dance behind the small glass door, and she understood for the first time in her life what the word hearth actually meant. It did not mean a fireplace. It meant a reason to stay. On the evening of the third day, she opened her grandfather's journal again. The first pages were the letter she had already read, but after that, the handwriting turned toward sketches. Careful measured drawings of interior walls, cabinet placements, plumbing runs, electrical paths. Arthur Hayes had planned every inch of this building, not as a shelter, as a home. She turned another page, and then she stopped, because the handwriting had changed. The neat, careful measurements gave way to something looser, something written late at night by a man who was not thinking about framing lumber. She held the lantern closer and read slowly. October 14th, talked to Leah today on the phone. She sounds thin, always thin now. She laughed when I asked about the girl, said Margot was doing just fine, that I shouldn't worry. I heard the lie. My own daughter and I heard the lie right through the wire. She left this house on her 19th birthday. Just walked out. I didn't stop her. I should have stopped her. God forgive me, I thought she'd come back. She didn't. Now she's got a daughter of her own, and I can hear the same thing in her voice I heard in mine all those years ago, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. All I know is this. If I can't save my daughter, I will by God save hers. Margot sat very still on the cold floor. The fire crackled in the stove. Her mother, Leah, had walked out of this man's house on her 19th birthday. Her mother had been 19. Margot was 19. It was not a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. Arthur Hayes had not picked her 19th birthday at random. He had picked it because it was the exact same age at which he had lost his daughter. He had spent the rest of his life preparing down to the dollar to keep from losing her granddaughter the same way. He had not been able to save Leah, so he had spent the next 20 years making sure someone could save Margot. Something hot and quiet moved through Margot's chest. It was not grief exactly. Grief has edges. This was softer. It was the weight of being seen, of being believed in, of being loved at a distance by a man she had barely known, for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. She closed the journal gently. She set it on top of the crate. She walked outside into the cold evening and stood in the clearing for a long time, looking up at the first stars appearing between the tops of the pine trees. I hear you, Grandpa, she whispered. The wind moved through the branches like an answer. The black Cadillac came up the dirt road on the morning of the 6th day. Margot was on the roof when she heard it. She was nailing a fresh sheet of corrugated metal over the patch she had made with the tarp, her mouth full of nails, her hammer in one hand. She heard the low sound of a heavy engine pushing its way up Old Timber Road, the kind of engine that did not belong in these mountains. She stopped mid-swing. She turned slowly and looked out over the edge of the roof. The Cadillac was long and black and polished to a mirror shine. It moved carefully over the ruts in the road, as if the driver could not quite believe he was still on a legal thoroughfare. It pulled into the clearing, bounced once over a deep hole, and came to a stop 10 feet from the front of the building. Two men got out. The first man was tall and thin and wore a charcoal suit that fitted him like it had been cut for him personally. His hair was silver at the temples and black on top, slicked back carefully. He wore a watch that caught the sun. He was maybe 55, maybe 60. He moved the way a man moves who is used to other people waiting for him. The second man was shorter, older, heavier through the middle. He wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots. Big work boots, the kind that would leave a print in soft dirt exactly the size Margot had seen 6 mornings ago. The thin man looked up at her on the roof. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Miss Hayes," he called out, "would you do us the kindness of coming down? I'd rather not shout." Margot took the nails out of her mouth. She did not answer him. She climbed down the ladder slowly, her heart pounding, her hammer still in her hand. She did not put it down when her boots hit the ground. She kept it at her side loose and easy the way Hollis Reed had taught her without ever saying a word about it. The thin man waited at the front of the Cadillac with his hands folded in front of him. "My name is Preston Vaughn," he said. "I represent Vaughn Mountain Holdings. And this," he gestured slightly toward the heavier man beside him, "is your great uncle." The heavier man stepped forward. He was maybe 55 years old. His face was red from the cold and from something else, something older, something that had been sitting in him for a very long time. He had pale eyes that looked a little like Margot's own, and the recognition of that made her stomach turn. "Roland Hayes," he said. His voice was rough. "Arthur was my older brother." Margot looked at him. She had never heard the name before in her life. "He never mentioned you," she said quietly. Roland's jaw tightened. "I'm not surprised," he said. Preston Vaughn smiled again smoothly, stepping into the silence before it could get awkward. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I'll be direct with you because I think you're the kind of young woman who appreciates directness. My company has been acquiring land in this valley for the past 6 years. Quietly, carefully. We are in the final stages of developing a 4-season resort that will bring 200 jobs to Silver Pine and raise the property values of every family within 20 miles. He paused. "Your grandfather's parcel is the last piece we need." Margot said nothing. "I understand you've only just come into possession of the property," Preston continued. "I imagine this is all a bit overwhelming. So let me make this simple for you." He pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He opened it slowly and held it up. "We are prepared to offer you $75,000. Cash. Today. You sign the transfer, we drive you into town, you walk out of the bank with a check. You never have to think about this building or this valley or these mountains ever again. $75,000. More money than Margot Hayes had seen in her entire life up until 6 days ago. She looked at the paper in his hand. She looked at the Cadillac, the suit, the watch, the polished shine of everything this man was offering her. And she looked past him at her Uncle Roland, who had stood silent during the entire speech, who had not once looked her in the eye. "Why now?" Margot asked quietly. Preston Vaughn paused. "I'm sorry." "Why now?" she repeated. "My grandfather bought this land 30 years ago. He died 3 years ago. Nobody came looking for it then. Nobody came looking for it last month. But I show up 6 days ago, and today there's a Cadillac in my driveway." Preston's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "The timing is coincidental, Miss Hayes." "No, it isn't." She said it calmly, quietly. The hammer was still in her right hand. There was a man outside my building 6 nights ago, she said. Work boots, big ones. Walked a full circle around the walls and stood at my front door for a long time in the middle of the night. She did not take her eyes off Preston Vaughn, but she saw in the corner of her vision her Uncle Roland shift his weight from one foot to the other. The boots he was wearing were exactly the right size. Preston Vaughn's smile tightened. Miss Hayes, I'm not selling. The words came out before she had finished deciding them, but once they were out, they felt solid. They felt true. They felt like a nail driven clean. Preston Vaughn studied her for a long moment. Then he folded the paper slowly and slid it back into his jacket pocket. I see, he said. I don't think you do, Margot said. He smiled again, thinner this time, a professional smile with nothing behind it. Miss Hayes, he said gently, let me give you some friendly advice since you're new to these mountains. This property has no utilities, no paved road, no recorded structures. The building behind you is a military surplus Quonset hut that has not been habitable in 30 years. Winter in this valley begins in 5 weeks. The temperature drops to 20 below zero on a bad night. You have no water. You have no power. You have no insurance. You are a 19-year-old young woman alone in the woods with a hammer and a rusted roof. His voice was soft, almost kind. $75,000 is a gift. Please understand that. The next conversation we have will not be as generous. Margot's grip on the hammer did not change. Mr. Vaughn, she said, I spent last night on a concrete floor in a building I own. I spent the night before that on a concrete floor in a building I own. I plan to spend tonight on a concrete floor in a building I own. She looked at him steadily. I've slept on worse floors, in worse places, in rooms that belonged to other people. This is mine, and I'm not leaving. Preston Vaughn's smile finally disappeared. He turned to Roland. Mr. Hayes, he said, would you like to say something to your niece? Roland Hayes opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. He looked at the ground. Margot realized slowly a man who had rehearsed this speech in his car on the way up the mountain and who now standing in front of the girl he had come to push off her grandfather's land could not make any of the words come out. Margot, he said finally, his voice was low. Your grandfather wasn't well at the end. He made decisions, legal decisions. That don't hold up. I've spoken to lawyers. The will that gave you this property was drafted during a period when my brother was not of sound mind. Margot looked at him. When did you last see him? She asked. Roland blinked. What? When did you last see your brother? There was a pause. It had been some time, Roland said carefully. How long? He did not answer. My grandfather came into that lawyer's office 12 years ago, Margot said. He sat in a chair and he paid the legal fees 10 years in advance so that I could walk into that office on my 19th birthday and pay $10 for the land he left me. You want to stand here and tell me he wasn't of sound mind? Roland's face darkened. You don't know anything about this family, girl. I know enough. You don't know anything. I know he didn't leave this land to you. The words came out sharper than she had meant them to. They hit Roland like a slap. For a second, his whole face tightened, and Margot saw underneath it the thing that had driven him up this mountain in a polished Cadillac, with a man in a $1,000 suit. Not greed. Grievance. He had been left out of something. A long time ago, and he had never gotten over it. Preston Vaughn touched Roland's elbow lightly, the way a handler touches a dog that is about to bark at the wrong time. Miss Hayes, Preston said smoothly, we will be in touch. They walked back to the Cadillac. Roland Hayes did not look at her as he climbed into the passenger seat. The engine started. The tires turned slowly over the ruts in the dirt road. Margot stood in the middle of the clearing with her hammer at her side and watched the black car disappear back into the pines. She stood there for a long time after they were gone. Her legs were shaking. She had not noticed until now. That night the fire came. She did not see it start. She was asleep, wrapped in the wool sweater and two tarps with the stove banked low for the night. What woke her was the smell, smoke, not the clean smoke of a wood stove, but something sharper, something with oil in it. She opened her eyes. Orange light was flickering through the crack in the roof. Margot was on her feet before she had finished understanding what she was seeing. She grabbed her hammer and ran for the door. Outside, a corner of the roof was burning. The new corrugated metal she had nailed down 3 days ago was already warped black at the edge, and the flames were climbing along the rope that held the tarp patch in place. Someone had thrown something onto the roof. A rag, a bottle, something soaked in fuel. She did not have time to think about it. She ran for the stream at the edge of the property with an empty bucket, filled it, ran back through the water up onto the fire from the ladder. She filled the bucket again and again. She threw water until her arms shook and her boots were soaked through and her lungs burned from the cold night air. The fire died slowly. It took her almost an hour to be sure it was out. When she finally climbed down the ladder, she was covered in soot and her hands were shaking too hard to hold the bucket. She sat down on the cold dirt in front of the building and looked at the blackened corner of her roof, and for the first time since she had stepped out of that housing center 6 mornings ago, she felt something break inside her chest. Not fear, rage, quiet, clean rage. They thought she would leave. They thought she would see the fire and pack her bag and walk down the mountain in the morning and sign the paper and take the check. They did not know her. She stayed out there until the sun came up. She did not sleep. She sat in the doorway of her building with her hammer across her knees and watched the tree line for any movement, any sound, any hint that someone might come back to finish the job. No one came. When the light finally returned to the clearing, she stood up, walked inside, and started to sweep up the soot. She was going to rebuild the corner before noon. She was moving a heavy bench away from the wall to get at a pile of burned debris when she felt it. The concrete under her boot shifted, just slightly, just enough that a person who had not been walking on that same floor for 6 days would never have noticed. Margot stopped. She got down on her hands and knees. She brushed the soot away from the crack in the concrete, and there underneath a thin layer of dust and a decade of accumulated dirt hidden under where the bench had sat for 30 years, was a thin metal seam, a rectangle, perfectly straight edges, heavy iron hinges at one side, a small recessed ring handle at the other, a trap door. Margot sat back on her heels. She stared at the floor. Underneath her building, underneath the bench, her grandfather had almost certainly placed there himself. Underneath 30 years of silence, there was something else, something that had been waiting for her. Something Roland Hayes did not know about. Something Preston Vaughn did not know about. Something that, if she opened it, would change everything she thought she had already understood about what her grandfather had left her. Her hand closed slowly around the iron ring. Outside, the morning wind moved through the pines, and in the distance, far down the dirt road, she heard the low sound of an engine starting. Margot's hand stayed on the iron ring for a long time. Outside, the engine was still running somewhere down the dirt road. It was not the heavy, polished sound of the Cadillac. This was something older. A pickup truck maybe with a muffler that had seen better winters. She held her breath and listened. The engine did not come closer. It idled for a minute, then turned and faded back down the mountain. She exhaled slowly. Then she looked down at the floor again. The iron ring was cold against her palm. The seam in the concrete was barely visible, no wider than the edge of a playing card. A man could walk across this floor for 30 years and never know what was underneath it. Arthur Hayes had known. Arthur Hayes had put it there. Margot stood up and walked to the front of the building. She looked out across the clearing. She looked at the tree line. She listened for one long minute to the sound of the morning wind in the pines. Then she went back inside and closed the heavy metal door behind her. She slid the old iron bar across the latch. For the first time since she had arrived, she locked herself in from the inside. She walked back to the trap door. She got down on her knees beside it. She pulled on the ring. At first, nothing happened. The door had not been lifted in years, maybe decades. She braced her feet against the concrete, wrapped both hands around the ring, and pulled harder. The door groaned. Then it lifted. A breath of cool, dry air came up out of the opening. It smelled like wood and oil and old paper. It did not smell like a grave. It smelled like a workshop. Margot leaned over the edge and looked down. A wooden ladder led about 10 feet down into darkness. She grabbed the oil lantern from beside the stove, lit it, and lowered it carefully through the opening. The flame caught the edges of something below. Wooden walls, a concrete floor, a workbench. She could make out the shapes of tools hanging neatly on the walls. She climbed down. The ladder creaked under her weight. Her boots touched the floor. She raised the lantern, and she stopped. Arthur Hayes had built a room down here. It was not a cellar. It was not a hiding place. It was a workshop. A full, proper living workshop built carefully under the concrete floor of the rusted building upstairs. The walls were lined with pine boards that had been sanded smooth and coated with linseed oil. A long workbench ran along one wall. Above the bench, on a pegboard that had been cut and fitted by hand, every tool he had ever owned hung in its proper place. Chisels, planes, files, a hand drill, 3 different saws, a set of carpenter's squares. Every tool had a dark outline painted behind it, so that a man could see at a glance if anything was missing. Nothing was missing. On the opposite wall was a small iron safe about the size of a microwave oven bolted to the floor. The dial was dusty, a thin layer of cobweb hung across the top. But what stopped Margot was not the safe. It was the wall at the far end of the room. Above a small plain drafting table, pinned up under a sheet of yellow glass, was a large architectural drawing. Hand-drawn, ink on paper. The kind of drawing a man makes with a ruler and a fine pen over many, many nights. She walked toward it slowly. She lifted the lantern higher. It was a blueprint of the building above her. Not the rusted Quonset hut she had been sleeping in. The building Arthur Hayes had intended that hut to become. The outside walls were the same, but the interior had been completely reimagined. She could see 6 small bedrooms along the curved walls, a large common room in the center with the wood stove, a long kitchen with a double sink, a mudroom at the entrance, a porch running the length of the front, a garden plot behind it. At the top of the blueprint, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were 3 words, Hayes Haven Home. And below that smaller, almost like a note to himself, a place for kids who don't have one. Margot lowered the lantern slowly. She stood in front of the drafting table for a long time. She did not cry. She had been expecting something down here. She had been expecting money or papers or proof. She had not been expecting a dream. She had not been expecting to find in the quiet underground workshop of a man she had barely known the exact shape of a life he had meant for her to build, a home for kids who didn't have one. She thought of herself walking out of the county housing center 6 mornings ago. She thought of the girls she had slept in rooms with for 4 years. She thought of every child she had ever seen handed across a doorway to a stranger with a clipboard. She thought of her own mother, 19 years old, walking out of the same family with nowhere to go and no one to go to. Arthur Hayes had not built her a shelter. He had built her a purpose. She turned toward the small iron safe. She knelt in front of it. She pulled a folded piece of paper out of her back pocket. She had taken it from the journal the night before without quite knowing why. On it, in her grandfather's handwriting, was a string of 6 numbers. No explanation, just the numbers. She spun the dial. The safe clicked open on the first try. Inside were 3 things. The first was a thick brown envelope. She opened it. Inside was a document on heavy legal paper stamped and notarized titled Last Will and Testament of Arthur M. Hayes. It was dated 11 years ago. She read it carefully, her lantern held close to the page. It left the entire property, all improvements, and all personal effects to his granddaughter, Margot Louise Hayes, on the occasion of her 19th birthday. It specifically named and specifically excluded his younger brother, Roland A. Hayes, citing in careful legal language a prior incident of financial misconduct for which this testator has neither forgotten nor forgiven. The document was signed by Arthur Hayes. It was witnessed by two names Margot did not recognize, and it was notarized on the last page by a stamp she did recognize. Ellery Whitmore, attorney at law, Silver Pine, Colorado. Margot set the will down carefully on top of the safe. She reached in for the second thing. It was a smaller envelope older than the first. She opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page, brittle at the edges. The letter was addressed to her grandfather. It was dated 31 years ago. She began to read. Arthur, I'm not going to dress this up. I sold the cabin. I sold it without telling you. I needed the money and I didn't want to ask. I know it was yours as much as mine. I know Pop left it to the two of us. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you what I did so you don't have to wonder. The money is gone. I won't tell you where. Don't come looking. Roland. Margot sat back on her heels. She read it again. 31 years ago, Roland Hayes had sold land that did not fully belong to him. He had taken money that was half his brother's. He had not asked. He had not offered to pay it back. And he had told his older brother in plain ink not to come looking. Arthur Hayes had not come looking. Arthur Hayes had done something much quieter and much more permanent. He had taken the rest of his life and he had rebuilt. Parcel by parcel, dollar by dollar, nail by nail. He had bought this land with his own money saved from his own work, out of his own grief. He had drawn his plans. He had hidden his savings in jars. He had paid his lawyer in advance. He had waited until his brother could not touch any of it, and then he had left the whole thing to the only member of the next generation he still believed in. Margot understood now. Roland Hayes had not come up the mountain this week because he believed the land was rightfully his. He had come because he had spent 31 years knowing in the quiet way a man knows these things that his older brother was building something he would never be part of. And now his older brother was dead, and the only thing standing between Roland Hayes and that building was a 19-year-old girl with a hammer. Margot took a long, slow breath. She reached into the safe for the third thing. It was a sealed envelope. Her name was written across the front in Arthur Hayes's handwriting. Margot, read last. She held it in her hand for a long moment. Then she set it carefully on top of the will unopened. She would read it last. He had asked her to. She was going to. She climbed back up the ladder into the building. She blew out the lantern. She closed the trapdoor and slid the heavy bench back over it. She went to the front of the building and unlocked the iron bar. She stepped out into the cold, bright morning. She walked to town. She walked the whole way because she needed the time. The bell above the door of the hardware store chimed softly. Hollis Reed looked out from his newspaper. He took one look at Margot's face. He folded the paper in thirds and set it aside. What did you find? He asked quietly. Everything, she said. Hollis closed the store early. He turned the sign on the door. He walked with her down the main street of Silver Pine past the diner and the feed supply and the post office the size of a garden shed to the small brick building at the far end with the brass plaque by the door. Whitmore and Associates. Ellery Whitmore was in his office. He looked up when they walked in. He took one look at the brown envelope in Margot's hand, and he slowly took off his glasses, and he folded them, and he set them on his blotter. I wondered if I would ever see that, he said. Margot set the will down on his desk. Ellery Whitmore read it carefully the way a man reads a document he has been waiting 11 years to read. When he finished, he looked up. I notarized this will in this office, he said. I witnessed your grandfather sign it. I filed a copy with the county. The county copy was recorded 11 years ago. Then why is there another will? Margot asked. Ellery sighed. Because your great-uncle filed a document 3 weeks after your grandfather's death, he said. A will he claimed was drawn up privately after the one I notarized. It was not witnessed by anyone I could verify. It left the property in trust to Roland Hayes pending the location and claim of the rightful heir, which according to that document was never found. He looked at her steadily. That document has been sitting quietly in probate for 3 years, waiting for a buyer to make it convenient to activate. Preston Vaughn, Margot said. Preston Vaughn, Ellery agreed. Hollis Reed spoke for the first time since they had walked in. "What does it take to make the fake will go away?" he asked. Ellery folded his hands on the desk. "It takes this," he said, tapping the document Margot had brought down from the mountain. "It takes the original, notarized, witnessed, and filed earlier in time. It takes Miss Hayes signing an affidavit that she received the key, the letter, and the instructions from me personally. And it takes the county clerk doing her job." He paused. "I can make a phone call this afternoon." "Make it," Margot said. Ellery Whitmore picked up the phone. The next 3 days were quiet. Margot did not see Preston Vaughn. She did not see Roland Hayes. She did not hear any footsteps at night. She did not hear the sound of a Cadillac engine on the dirt road. Whatever was happening in offices and courthouses and phone calls far from the clearing where she slept. She did not wait for it. She went back to work. She framed 2 of the 6 interior walls from her grandfather's blueprint. She did it mostly by herself. Hollis Reed came up the mountain twice, once to deliver lumber, once to help her set the roof bracing on the longest wall. He did not stay long either time. He did not tell her what to do. He just handed her nails when her hands were full, and when the wall stood up straight on the first try, he nodded once and said, "Your grandfather would have liked the way you hit that last nail." She did not say anything, but she had to turn her face away for a minute. On the 4th morning, Ellery Whitmore's car came up the dirt road. He was not alone. A woman in a gray coat was with him carrying a briefcase. She was the county clerk. They stood in the clearing and Ellery handed Margot a single sheet of paper. It was an order from the county probate court. The will filed by Roland A. Hayes 3 years ago had been ruled invalid. The original will filed by Arthur M. Hayes 11 years ago was recognized as the sole and legitimate testamentary instrument. The property in its entirety belonged to Margot Louise Hayes, free and clear, with no encumbrance, no dispute, and no pending claim. There would be no lawsuit. There would be no hearing. Roland Hayes, when presented with the notarized original and the 31-year-old letter about the cabin he had sold, had withdrawn his claim within 24 hours. He had not even asked for a meeting. Ellery Whitmore said quietly that sometimes a man spends his whole life running from a piece of paper, and when it finally catches up with him, he has nothing left to say. Preston Vaughn had not called. Preston Vaughn was not going to call. Vaughn Mountain Holdings had, Ellery said, carefully revised their development plan to exclude the Hayes parcel. Their resort would be built around it or not at all. Margot's building would stand untouched on the last piece of wild land in that part of the valley. She took the paper from Ellery's hand. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and slid it into her back pocket. "Thank you," she said. The county clerk nodded. Ellery Whitmore shook her hand. They got back in the car and drove back down the mountain, and Margot stood in the clearing by herself with her hammer at her side and looked up at her building. Her building. Hers. Free and clear. The wind moved through the pine trees. That evening, she opened the last envelope. She did it alone. She built up the fire in the stove, put on her wool sweater, and sat on a wooden bench she had built herself 3 days earlier. The lantern was low. The building was warm. She broke the seal. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the page. "Margot, if you're reading this, it means you found the workshop. And if you found the workshop, it means you did not sell, which means you already know most of what I want to say. I'm going to say it anyway. I did not leave you money, sweetheart. You think I did, but I didn't. I left you evidence. Evidence that you are a person who can build something. Evidence that you are a person who can be trusted with a key and a crate in a piece of land in the woods. Evidence that you are my granddaughter, and therefore that you will not be chased off by work boots in the night or by a man in a nice suit in the morning." The money in the jars was not a gift. It was a tool. It was the cost of the nails and the lumber and the shingles you will need to build what I could not finish. Spend it on the building. Spend it on the kids you will bring here. Do not spend it on yourself. You will not need to. You are the kind of person who, given a hammer and a reason, will never be poor again. I failed your mother. I will not dress that up. I was her father, and she walked out of my house at 19. And I did not go after her, and I did not find her, and I did not save her. I told myself she would come home. She did not come home. She had a daughter of her own, and then she died in a motel room. And I spent the rest of my life working out what I should have done differently. What I should have done was follow her. I did not follow you either, Margot, but I want you to understand why. I did not follow you because I knew the state would not let me take you. Not without a fight that would have cost me the house, the land, and every dollar I was saving to give you a future that would actually be yours. So I did the only thing a stubborn old man can do when he cannot reach a child. I built her a place to come home to. Every nail in that building is a nail I drove for you. Every board is a board I planned for you. Every dollar in those jars is a dollar I set aside for you. From a life I kept simple on purpose. I ate beans and cornbread for 30 years, Margot. I did not mind. I was saving. If you are reading this, you have opened the workshop. You have seen what I wanted this place to be. I want to be clear with you. You are not obligated to build it. If you want to take the money and go to college, go. If you want to sell the land now that it is properly yours and start a life somewhere warm, do it. I will not haunt you. A gift is not a leash. But I drew those plans for a reason. You know the reason, sweetheart. You have always known the reason. There are kids in this country who walk out of buildings on their 19th birthday with a backpack and $43 and no idea where to go. You were one of them. Your mother was one of them. I was one of them a long time ago in a different way. Somebody has to build them a place. It does not have to be you, but it can be. That is all I wanted to say. One last thing, the man at the hardware store is Hollis Reed. He was my best friend. He is the only person in Silver Pine who knows the whole story. If you ever need anything at all, and I am not there, he is there. Trust him the way you would have trusted me. Hit him clean, kid. Grandpa. P.S. I am sorry I missed your birthdays. Margot read the letter twice. Then she read the postscript a third time slowly just to be sure of the words. I am sorry I missed your birthdays. She set the letter down on the bench beside her. She put her face in her hands. And for the first time since she had left the housing center, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margot Hayes allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet crying of a child, not the swallowed crying of a teenager with no privacy, the full open crying of a young woman who had been carrying something heavy for 19 years and had finally, in a warm building that belonged to her, been given permission to set it down. She cried for her mother. She cried for her grandfather. She cried for the 9-year-old girl who had stood at the edge of a gravel driveway and been told, hit 'em clean, kid, and then had not seen the man who said it for 10 years. She cried for a long time. When she was finished, she sat very still. Then she picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the leather journal between the blueprints and the sketches of interior walls. She put another log in the stove. She got to work. 2 years later, on a late afternoon in October, Margot Hayes stood on the porch of a building that no longer looked rusted. The corrugated metal walls had been clean sealed and painted a dark forest green. New windows ran along the curved sides, each one framed in pine she had milled and fitted herself. A long covered porch built from cedar stretched across the front of the building with 2 rocking chairs and a bench and a pair of work boots drying upside down on a rack beside the door. A hand-carved wooden sign hung above the entrance. Hayes Haven Home. Inside the building had become exactly what Arthur Hayes had drawn on the blueprint 30 years before. 6 small bedrooms along the curved walls. A large common room with a wood stove at its center where 6 teenagers aged 15 to 18 were doing homework at a long wooden table Margot had built from the same cedar as the porch. A kitchen with a double sink where an older woman from town named Delphine was teaching a 15-year-old boy how to make cornbread from scratch. A mudroom by the front door full of work boots and backpacks and at least 4 different jackets that did not belong to anyone in particular. The garden plot out back had produced tomatoes, squash, and enough green beans to last the winter. The 14-year-old girl who had carried the last basket in from the garden that afternoon was named Junie. She had been at Hayes Haven for 6 months. She had not spoken for the first 3 weeks after she arrived. She was talking now. She had not stopped since dinner the night before. Margot stood on the porch and listened to her laugh through the open door. Hollis Reed was sitting in one of the rocking chairs beside her. He was 73 years old. His hair had gone fully white. He still opened the hardware store at 7 every morning, but he came up the mountain for dinner most Sundays, and on the porch of Hayes Haven, he had taken to calling the kids inside by their first names, which was in Silver Pine, considered a mark of high affection. Ellery Whitmore came up once a month with a thermos of coffee and a folder of paperwork. Roland Hans. Margot had moved to Arizona. Preston Vaughn had built his resort around her property without her consent and without her blessing. From her porch, she could see the chairlift in the distance carrying skiers up a ridge that had once been only pine. She did not look at it often. It did not belong to her, and she did not belong to it. What belonged to her was this. Margot was 21 years old now. Her hands were no longer soft. Her shoulders were broader. There was a small, permanent callus at the base of her right thumb from the way she gripped a hammer. Her hair was longer. She wore flannel. She moved through her own building the way her grandfather had once moved through his, slowly, carefully, the way a person moves who is not trying to prove anything. The sun was dropping behind the ridge. The sky was turning orange, then pink, then the soft bruised purple of a Colorado evening in October. Hollis Reed was quiet in the rocking chair beside her. After a while, he spoke. "Your grandfather would have sat right here," he said. Margot nodded. "I know," she said. They watched the light change for a long time. Inside, one of the older boys was asking Delphine for a second piece of cornbread. Junie was telling Junie's story, whatever it was, tonight at top volume. Someone had put an old country song on the radio at low enough volume that it sounded like weather. Margot thought about the morning she had walked out of the housing center with a backpack and $43. She thought about the bus ride up into the mountains. She thought about the $10 bill she had placed on Ellery Whitmore's desk, and the iron key he had slid across in return, and the long walk up Old Timber Road with her feet blistering inside her boots. She thought about the wooden crate in the beam of sunlight. She thought about the footsteps outside the wall in the middle of the night. She thought about a black Cadillac in her driveway. She thought about a trap door under a bench. She thought about a blueprint pinned behind glass in an underground workshop, drawn by a man who had not been able to save his own daughter, and who had spent the rest of his life making sure his granddaughter would not need saving. She thought about a letter that ended with, "I am sorry I misses your birthdays." She looked out at the clearing where she had first stood, thinking she had bought a worthless piece of land for $10. She understood now what she had actually bought. Not a building, not an inheritance, not even a home. She had bought a foundation. Concrete and iron and pine poured and hammered and planed by a man who had loved her from a distance for 19 years, and who had trusted her at the end to finish what he had started. A $10 piece of land, a $45,000 crate, a $1.8 million offer from a man in a black Cadillac. None of those numbers had been the real price. The real price had been this: to walk out of a locked building on her 19th birthday with $43 and to say yes anyway to a stranger's map. To open a door that had been chained shut for 30 years and to refuse to run when footsteps came in the night. To hold a hammer when a Cadillac pulled into her driveway and to say, "I'm not selling," without knowing yet that she was allowed to. That was the price, and she had paid it. Margot Hayes stood on the porch of a building she had rebuilt with her own hands beside an old man who had waited 3 years to meet her, and she watched the last of the evening light fade between the tops of the pine trees. Behind her inside, a teenager laughed. The sound carried out through the open door into the clearing and up into the cold October sky, and somewhere Margot Hayes believed all the way to a quiet place where an old carpenter was finally able to rest. "Hit 'em clean, Grandpa," she said softly. The wind moved through the pines like an answer. And on the hand-carved sign above the door of the building she had built, the last of the sun caught the letters and held there for one long moment before the dark came on. Hayes Haven Home, a place for kids who don't have one.